Good morning, everybody. In this session, I think we're going to be focusing in particular about ideas connected with the formation or the pre-formation of the First International. And we're going to start with Professor Greg Claeys from Royal Holloway in London, and he's going to talk about positivism and its relationship to the foundation of the First International.
Good morning. Thanks, Gareth. Well, having endured the ritual humiliation of one's national team thrashed last night, nationalism seems the appropriate starting point this morning. After 1789, the need to define some form of higher loyalty above patriotism was an obvious focal point for participants in the international movement for democratic and social reform. Initially, of course, the rights of man provided one such nexus of identity, loosely linked, even before 1789, to an affiliation with humanity as such. As we saw yesterday, a variety of groupings took up this and modified it in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. The immediate predecessor of the IWMA, the International Association, which was founded in 1855, attacked what it called the selfishness of nationalities and proclaimed its goal as being the creation of, quote, a society which, consisting of members of different nationalities, may represent the future equality of peoples and may accustom the mind to the idea of fraternity. By 1864, one other little-known option, provided by the positivism of Auguste Comte, was on offer. This, inter alia, was presented at the first speech given at the founding meeting of the IWMA on the 28th of September 1864 by the chairman of the meeting, Edward Spencer Beazley. When Beazley opened the proceedings at St. Martin's Hall, Long Acre, he was professor of history at University College London. He was a friend of many working-class leaders in this period, some of whom we heard about yesterday, including George Odger, George Howell, Robert Applegarth, and so on. And on that day, indeed, he was a great deal better known in Britain as a public figure than Karl Marx. Indeed, it has been suggested by Royden Harrison and others that the founding of the IWMA owes a great deal more to Beazley than it did to Marx, whose invitation was almost an afterthought. In Britain, moreover, it is no exaggeration to suggest that the positivist influence on the left was as great, or perhaps even greater, than Marx's, up until the First World War. The positivist role, certainly in founding the International, was suggested as early as 1883 in a comment that, I quote, Comtism furnished the framework of an international alliance between working men, and the International Association is declared to be its logical conclusion. This statement may have resulted from the positivists' infamous defense of the Paris Commune of 1871, which to them exemplified the possibility of small-scale federalist government. Comte's ideas certainly inspired Ernst Belford Bax, William Morris, and most of the Fabians. He was particularly significant, Beazley especially, for H.M. Heinemann, and also for the Labour Church movement from which the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, and then subsequently the Labour Party itself would emerge. The contrast I want to make briefly this morning is between Beazley and Marx on the issue of nationalism and patriotism. Obviously, this is a rich and complex issue, and I can unpack it only to quite a limited degree. Beazley began his opening presentation describing the origins of that very meeting at another gathering in April of 1863. He trusted that, he said, that the current occasion aimed to create a cooperative and fraternal feeling between the working men of England and other countries. The report of the speech continues. This is the sole report we have from the Beehive. He entered into, at length, the necessity of a close alliance between France and England as necessary to secure and maintain the liberties of the world. He denounced the wrongdoings of government in violating international rights, and the English government, he said, was as bad, if not worse, than many of the continental powers. It's fairly heretical stuff in Britain. England wrongfully held possession of Gibraltar from Spain, and her conduct in China, Japan, India, and elsewhere was cowardly and unprincipled. He urged upon all those present to divest themselves of those selfish feelings disguised under the name of patriotism, and to maintain only those principles which their consciences told them were right and just. So 4 issues, I think, clearly stand out here. The idea of a European League, which would promote peace, inspired originally by Saint-Simon, in which Britain and France would play leading roles. Positivist opposition to empire, their principled renunciation of that form of patriotism, which they saw as increasingly linked to imperialism, and their willingness to promote British, French, and other working class organizations of mutual assistance. I want to concentrate today only on the first of these 2 issues, or the 2 first of these, anti-imperialism initially and then patriotism. In 19th century Britain, the nation was rapidly expanding, of course, to become an enormous empire, and what came eventually to be called jingoism was one logical result of this. The positivists were the single most outspoken critics of this process for the better part of the next half century. More than any other group, they dared, as we've seen, to urge the renunciation of existing possessions like Gibraltar, and they condemned all new acquisitions. As religious agnostics, they recognized that the religious argument favoring conquest was immensely important. As historians of religion, this of course is Kant's point of departure, they also recognized the development of worship from fetishism to polytheism and monotheism, and deduced from this the need to tolerate Islam and every other form of religious observance, while aiming, of course, at the final destination of the religion of humanity. And so they championed an organic theory of human development, which recognized the rights of indigenous and particularly non-Christian peoples and smaller states to preserve their independence against all external encroachment. These ambitions were displayed most notably in a work which was being written at the time that the IWA was founded, which was published in 1866, a volume called International Policy, in which, on the basis of Kant's teachings, they argued that all empires and nations ought to be devolved into city-states of no more than a few million inhabitants. This, they thought, was the largest number of people capable of feeling a sentiment of mutual affection, which might legitimately be called patriotism. This, of course, would be supplemented by a further attachment to the religion of humanity, which would unite, in particular, the Western European nations under the leadership of France and Britain. And the headquarters, of course, was to be in Paris, the Pope, so to speak, of the religion of humanity, and a stone's throw away from here, of course, at number 10, Rue Monsieur le Prince, was the headquarters of the movement. The sources of this strategy lay in Kant's theory of the ideal human group. Kant regarded the family, and one could talk here also about an interesting contrast with Marx and some of Marx's later followers, as the basic unit of society. He held its existing patriarchal composition sacred, to the dismay of his more feminist admirers like John Stuart Mill. His view of patriotism derived from a psychology of what might be called proximate attachment. He insisted, I quote, that the sense of nationality ought to be subordinate to larger feelings of international fraternity. At present, national prejudice was strongest in the middle classes, in fact, principally due to industrial competition. By contrast, he thought, and Marx, of course, is in agreement here, the working class is more free than any other from international prejudices, because working men feel how similar their wants and their conditions are in all countries, and this feeling checks their animosity. Patriotism nonetheless remains for Kant indispensable, as he puts it, to the complete development of the social instinct, which it alone can preserve alike from the narrowness of family feeling and the vagueness of philanthropy. Here we have a sense of the levels of our ability to attach ourselves to other groups. Our first and primary loyalty is to the family, but for Kant and his followers, there must be some intermediary level of attachment, and then finally, at the highest level, the religion of humanity. This, Kant said, implied dividing Europe into 70 large city-states, republics of perhaps 1 to 3 million people each, making perhaps 500 states in total for the whole earth, none larger than Belgium, Tuscany, or Sardinia. All the world might be remade on the basis of the same model of devolved federalism. Thus, in 1871, what the Commune meant to the Positivists was above all the principle of substituting what is called municipalized provinces for a centralized empire. This involved rejecting majoritarian democratic oppression in favor of minority rights, as well as, of course, renouncing a standing army. This idea of local patriotism has some parallels to in the IWMA, Mazzini's arguments as well. Mazzini goes on to suggest that what he terms the barren cosmopolitan idea of the abolition of the idea of country and nationality, which he thought the International represented, ought, of course, simply to be rejected. So let me briefly then consider the contrast here with Marx. And Marx, by the middle of the 1840s, of course, increasingly saw the process of international economic competition as destroying national exclusiveness, the exclusiveness of separate nations. Marx was, however, considerably less critical of imperialism, praising the destructive aspects of British rule in India, in acting as what Marx calls the unconscious tool of history in undermining the village community. Engels similarly applauds the French conquest of Algeria. Marx also, of course, remains disdainful of what he terms the historyless small nations of Europe, and argues that any sentimental consideration, as he puts it, for small nations like the Czechs should be set aside. Now, what's unclear, certainly in the early stages here, is whether Marx and Engels' case is that nationalities will eventually be abolished, or merely national antagonisms. In the 1860s and early 1870s, there's some evidence of a shift in this viewpoint, as was already suggested in part yesterday, with the rise of Fenianism and the possibility of Irish independence, and then what was described as the domino effect following from that, as well as the individual case of Poland. Engels wrote to Karl Kautsky that two nations in Europe have not only the right but even the duty to be nationalistic before they become internationalistic. The Irish and the Poles. They are most internationalistic when they are genuinely nationalistic. Well, think through that puzzle if you like. Beazley's strategy, then, in 1864, was intended to promote a mutual toleration of national difference while balancing the need to move all humanity towards civilization. Given Marx's disdain for backward and historyless peoples, this made positivism less prone to what we might today call a civilizational bias than Marxism. It tended less, if we move forwards towards the years of the Second International, towards that variation on socialist imperialism, which would arise to a position of surprising prominence in the years just prior to the First World War. It also made the positivists much more immediately sympathetic to movements like Fenianism. Most of the British Comtes, and it is certainly much more than a coincidence, had an Irish background. Beazley's mother, for example, was Irish. This nation yearning to be free of Britain's yoke was thus for the positivists a paradigm for their own peculiar kind of revolutionism. Yet this was to be accomplished within a framework of both working-class international organizations, a kind of European patriotism, and the religion of humanity. And we are today, I think, taking up the last point in particular, the religion of humanity, accustomed to mock this viewpoint, given the oddities of the cult or sect which it appears Kant wishes to substitute for traditional Christianity. We might, in this respect, however, recall that Marxism, too, eventually assumes the form of a secular religion. That statement is not as controversial, was made yesterday, it's not as controversial today in circles like this as it was 20 years ago, even. Its distance from Kantism is smaller here, I think, accordingly, and there are some contemporaries who point to the relative proximity of positivism and Marxism in a number of areas that perhaps would surprise us today. So the point we might perhaps reiterate today is that it's been clear since the French Revolution that determining a higher locus of loyalty than the nation was bound to be very problematic from the outset. We can explore this already in the 1790s. Allegiance to the cause of some form of cosmopolitan republicanism, as Beazley calls it, or revolutionary democratic internationalism, as we might term it today, had led Thomas Paine to aid Napoleon in his proposed invasion of Britain in 1804. Paine, of course, by then an American citizen, but born in Britain, and therefore actively, as far as Britain was concerned, acting as a traitor to his own nation. Around 1900, we witness a similar paradoxical scenario, with Ernest Belford Bax finding himself theoretically in an identical situation with potentially divided loyalties, torn between a revolutionary regime with progressive principles and his own nation, and happy, he confessed, to allow foreign invaders to impose correct principles on Britain. The revolutionary movement of the 20th century, ironically, probably did far more to promote nationalism than to undermine it. At any rate, it cannot be said, I think, that we have reached a satisfactory resolution of this problem in the 21st century, but it is certainly, if one can add to Marcel's most profoundly depressing presentation, but I think extraordinarily accurate one last night, the observation that only a higher form of unity can meet the current challenge of the concentration of international capital. We require then some form of higher unity once again to attract our loyalty to rise to the occasion of the present crisis. As we speak, of course, the European idea threatens to unravel once again, and it is perhaps worthwhile in this sense reminding ourselves of the implications of failing to rise to this challenge. Thank you.